And once again, just thank you all for coming. As I say, this is one of the most booked up sessions that we've had. Today, we have James Corazzo and Layla Gahrib, who are going to be talking to us about informalities in design education. I don't think there's anything else I need to tell anybody about anything. So I'm just going to hand over to James and Layla, if that's okay with you both. We're going to be trying a slightly different format today. So please bear with us for some of the things that we're going to do. But I'm just going to hand over to you, James and Layla.
Well, thanks, Derek. I guess, do you feel like we need to introduce ourselves, Layla? I think Derek's done that. Do you want to add to it?
No, we could just say hi. It's nice to see everybody.
Yeah, and thank you for coming. As Derek's alluded to, and we did put it in the abstract. I think in the abstract we sort of framed this as both a presentation and a workshop. Maybe workshop was massively overstating the level of interaction that's going to actually take place. But there will be a few things for you to do and some conversations for you to have in small groups amongst yourselves. And we will also be kind of doing some presenting. So I guess I'm going to share my screen and we can get started proper then. Is there a thing there? Some images? Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Layla. Thank you, Derek, from both of us. And thank you to Nicole, who I don't know if Nicole's here today, but Derek and Nicole edited the special issue of the journal in which this paper that we're talking about comes from. So thanks very much for that opportunity. This study that we're going to talk about actually starts in like 2019. Even though the special issue of the journal was really kind of about, I guess, to some extent, pandemic teaching in design education and the challenges. But this study actually starts before the pandemic, when we were really interested in starting to think about like generating what we were calling at the time spatial accounts of learning. So really, one of the questions we were asking ourselves is, what is the role of physical studio in learning to design? Now, the literature, design education research literature certainly tends to be, there are exceptions, but it tends to be very focused on discourse that takes place in the studio. So how, and the kind of conversations that take place, or like key activities. The crit is often the one that people focus on because perhaps it's one of the more visible moments in the studio that someone can kind of try to make sense of. What tends to happen is that space and materiality gets backgrounded in that process. Certainly in that research. Now, this is sort of part of an absence that happens more broadly in the social sciences and has been happening for a long, long time. So it's not exclusive to us, but I think kind of one of the things that we really reflected on is that the physical studio is such a rich and vibrant and absolutely central kind of part of design education. We found it interesting that that researchers, including ourselves, find it difficult to talk about space and materiality in relation to education. We particularly struggle, I think, as a community to articulate what's going on there. And often we are being asked to articulate that to people that might be coming and saying, why do you need all of that space? So certainly in the UK, it's just coming obviously from a very UK perspective here. So certainly this idea of being able to language it felt like useful. So we started this study, and we'll say a little bit about the methodology in a moment. Well, we were really looking at students' spatial accounts of learning. So like the relationship between space and the studio and how they were learning. And we collected data, myself and Layla. We began the analysis, and then the pandemic happened and we shelved it all, like everyone else went into that emergency state. And, you know, even after 6 months, I can remember thinking about that work that we'd done, and it felt like it was such a part of a different reality, and one that we might not be kind of getting back to. It kind of felt redundant and even quaint to be thinking about those kinds of things. But I think as we began to settle into teaching in a distance education mode, in an largely online mode, myself and Layla started to think about it again, because I guess we were reflecting on the differences that we were having to contend with, as everybody was. And actually, started to think that maybe, far from being redundant, actually the fact that we collected this, it could be a really interesting moment to kind of like reach back towards that and see what that kind of difference, where we are now, looking back at that data, where we're going to look at it in a different way. And we did start to look at it in a different way. In fact, we started to become much more interested in this idea of the informal and the everyday routines. Now, our data had collected a lot of stuff on that. So this kind of, I guess, this finally gets us to what today's talk / interaction is going to be around, which is, I suppose, around informal pedagogy. So before we go any further, we have a question for you all. And this is one for the chat. So please, everybody, put this into the chat, or put a response into the chat. We're curious. What do you think of as informal pedagogy? So you could answer that as a one-word association with that term. You might have a coherent sentence. You might feel it's something that's quite uncertain and hard to articulate. We're not testing because, as you will see as we go through this presentation, I think the concept of informality gets increasingly problematic for us, actually, in terms of trying to kind of articulate it, certainly, or pin it down. So I'm going to give you a moment to type into the chat, and I'll be quiet. I can't actually see the chat. Layla, is anything appearing?
It is, yeah. I've got some great things. Corridor conversations, subconscious observations, chance meetings, extracurricular
Fantastic.
social interactions. Great stuff. Party.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Please keep them coming. There might be something that we reach back to later on as well. And it'll also, I guess, be interesting to reflect on whether those responses start to shift or kind of get strengthened by some of the things we might say. So look, in the first instance, perhaps full-heartedly, we're going to try to define, or I'll have at least a working definition of informal pedagogy. And we're going to do this by, I suppose, if you were to think about formal pedagogy, if you were to think about the studio and to strip away all of the color, the life, the excitement, the nuance, the interesting stuff, if we were to try to take it down to its most skeletal core, then we might say that really it's formed of a structure that might look something like this. A project or a brief or assignment is set, and the students then produce work in response to that. At one point, at some points, in some form, that work is then critiqued, or there is feedback on that work. So there's a kind of reflection. And then that informs further iterations of that creative work. This is what Schaffer called cycles of design. So look, it is absolutely technocratic and stripped of any color we omit here. The other part of Schaffer's model that I think is interesting to think about is he talked about these smaller cycles that are revolving as well. He called them, for example, a desk crit, a little bit less formal, where there is still like work being produced, and then there's feedback or critique, which is informing a further iteration. So we could, it's a very limited version, but we could say this is formal pedagogy, and the kind of things that we do in formal pedagogy might be tutorials, bring in guest speakers, run workshops, seminars, etc., etc. Please note, by the way, that where we've placed those on that circle, they aren't part of the cycle in that way. There's nothing sequential about where those things are, and lots of those things may or may not be present in your studios, and there may indeed be things that you do that aren't there. But we're just trying to sort of establish a kind of, I guess, a basic definition of what we might call formal pedagogy. So it's kind of that stuff. Colin Gray's done quite a lot of stuff around informal, particularly around informal peer critique. And in one of his papers, he kind of comes the closest that I've seen really to trying to kind of define, I suppose, formal pedagogy, the explicit and implicit curriculum enacted through traditional educational structures there. So we're hinting at some of those educational structures. I think what Colin's definition does there is it expands it out a little bit more to include other aspects of the educational process. So there's formal. So what might informal be in relation to this? Well, maybe it's that stuff. And I don't know if any of this chimes with what's in the chat, but it's that thing we might call studio culture. It's that sort of hazy thing of community, for example, or chance, or the stuff we feel. It's a very lived thing. perhaps we observe it, but it's much harder to kind of like articulate, I suppose, what it might be. And that's what we became really interested in. So in our paper, we summarize an aspect of informal pedagogy, not definitional, but a way of capturing it as we saw it in 2019, the low hum of activity and inactivity, moving, talking, walking, these everyday routines that seem to be kind of taking place in the studio amongst those more formal interactions. So hopefully there's a kind of a little bit of a sense there of what informal might be, maybe. Now, we're going to say a little bit about our methodology. So this is methodology part one. This is pre-pandemic methodology. So this is still in a physical studio. And the question I guess myself and Layla were asking ourselves is how do you kind of get a sense of what these informal interactions might be? They're hardest to get at. A lot of them happen outside of the view of the tutor, of people in the studio. How do we track that every day? We ended up kind of alighting on this, what can be called ethnographic mapping. And this felt like a realistic way in which we might get some kind of insight into that everyday stuff. I guess kind of a traditional ethnographer with unlimited resources might hang around the studio for a year and be a kind of co-participant and kind of be able to understand informalities and all that everyday stuff in that way. But we didn't really have either the resources, time, or even kind of our relationship really to the students in that situation would have been problematic. So we're using this method of ethnographic mapping. I'm going to say what that is in a moment, but just really quickly, a tiny little bit about where the study took place. It took place in the UK at a post-1992 university, so that's like a modern university. Approximately 70% of the students at this institution come from underrepresented backgrounds in higher education. The program that we were studying was a graphic design program with about 100 students in each year. And our study focused on the final year cohort. And obviously, because we were also interested in space and materiality, those students were part of a large studio that most of them could be in at the same time. Virtually all of their teaching took place in there, other than kind of using workshops and stuff like that. So all the formal teaching and I guess all the other activities happened in that space. So that was kind of what we were researching there. So we used, like I said, this method of ethnographic mapping. So effectively, we interviewed a student at the end of the day, one by one, in the studio in which they'd been that day. And they were given a large sheet of paper, as you can see there, and they were asked to draw out the studio. And then they were asked to map and record, to trace, actually, that's probably a better word, the journeys they had taken that day. And that drawing, as you can see really there, became a kind of a way to have a conversation really about what was happening. So what we're going to argue is what's useful about ethnographic mapping, what's powerful about it, is it's not so much the mapping out of the studio itself, it's the tracing where it kind of really comes into its own, because really what's happening there is that well, as Ingold says, there's a gestural reenactment of those journeys made, and there's something around the participant in placing themselves back in that sort of space, and those kind of like mundane moments, the places they walked around, becomes part of the conversation that may get left out of other conversations with students around what's going on in the design process. So while theorists like Pink can be critical of this idea of mapping, particularly the idea of like mapping spaces out that can feel like a fixed view from above, and the drawings of the spaces are fixed views from above, and there's all sorts of challenges with that way of looking at things. What we think the trace allowed to happen was the sense of students being able to move back through that space, and as the person that was interviewing them being able to move through that space with the students and ask them about those kind of like innocuous, very mundane moments, as well as maybe the important things that happened, I suppose. So Pink talks about the idea of, rather than mapping out, moving through is important because it enables us to understand life as it progresses through an environment. So in a reduced way, this method maybe gave us some access to that process. And we really like this quote as well. in a way, this method becomes this way to meander with the body that pees. So remembering it's not just what they say about their meaningful interactions in the studio, it's also all those other elements of the embodied sense of being in that space that kind of that matters. Right then, I'm going to pause here. I'm going to hand over to Layla that's going to cut straight to what we found out.
Thanks, James. Yeah, and well, I'm going to start speaking, like James said, about some of the results that came out of those kind of mapping exercises. So we came to see informal pedagogy as fulfilling 5 core functions of what we're starting to call the social studio, the comparative studio, the organizational studio, the processual studio, and the performative studio. So I'm going to go into each of those functions a little bit and say a little bit about how we're beginning to define these different functions. So the social studio is, we came to see as a space that encapsulates the interactions that happen outside of working habits. The social studio acts as a catalyst for friendships and collaboration. It describes comfort and familiarity with the space. So we found that the social to be this larger function of the 5 that the others kind of sat within. Almost we compared it to almost a watery function that flows in and around the rest of them. And we really start to hear that within student accounts during the interviews. So for example, this participant reflected on those interactions as engaging in the space, not the course space. People that came and made a proof, for example, were engaging in the space, not graphic design, not illustration. They're engaging in the space, which we see even further in, in other student reflections when they say, I feel more involved in the space, I've had more input into the space, so I feel more comfortable in it. So if we move on to the comparative studio, so the second function of what we've begun to outline is this idea of the studio being a space where students benchmark themselves against their peers and observe each other's workings. And that unfolds in different ways. For example, this student spoke of almost a level of censorship that was involved in working in an open studio space, the awareness of seeing and being seen. And, compared to accounts from students who opted to work outside of the studio space, because not all students, found that space a space that they wanted to work in. So we begin to see that comparative function. It creates without that, it can create a level of uncertainty. The students are without access to looking over peers' shoulders to see if they're, as this student describes, doing the right thing. So the organizational studio function describes the way students use the space to manage projects, keep on track, and use the studio to not be at home to do work. So that function, I guess, is implemented by students to separate home and studio life. So the studio acts as a site, a separation that for some students felt important to create that healthy work-life balance. So, student accounts such as I never do work at home, and that's not because I'm lazy. I refuse to spend my evenings doing work at home. For me, home is my space. So that function really becomes important in that creating almost that separation of what some students found to use. So the processual studio function, I guess, begins to unpack the different areas and places that students use to undertake various parts of the design process. This may be other places in the studio or outside of it entirely. So it's within that function that we begin to see how the studio, I guess, supports the different stages of the design process and acts, for example, as a base camp to bring materials back to. I think we've got some student reflections of that kind of way of thinking, and also where they could just plan for the next point of action. So, students would go to the library, get books, bring books back. The studio acted as that space of returning. And we saw that mapped out quite nicely in those interviews that we conducted of like the going out and coming back in, that kind of movement in and out of the space in order to manage the design process became quite an interesting kind of place that we was exploring. And then finally, the performative studio function discusses, I guess, how the studio contributed to the students' designly identity. So I think what that began to reveal to us was that the studio almost acted as this site to rehearse professionalism, with students sharing that, to appear studious or to be visible would, how they described it, begin to open more doors for you. So those were the 5 functions that we began to identify. And yeah, you want to say a little bit about this slide, James?
Yeah, just so, I mean, certainly in our paper, we started to kind of like see this as undergirding, as kind of being sort of sitting underneath. I guess we kind of felt like we were seeing below the waterline, really, when we first started to come across this stuff. So this kind of is undergirding, but absolutely kind of intrinsic part of that kind of more formal, very stripped back cycle, obviously, that we suggested was going on there. And the reason the social kind of, I think, Layla, you alluded to it, didn't it? It was more watery and kind of, it felt like it kind of expanded across all of those things, hence the social being the bigger space there, and then these more specific activities that were kind of related to learning, even though they were kind of happening outside of any formal kind of pedagogy or formal teaching, I suppose, were still kind of were present. Layla, I think are we going to stop for an activity now? Does that?
I think that sounds good. Isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. So we've got some more things to say about I suppose some discussion around those results actually, and some implications and some more problematizing of how we're setting up informal and informal there. But we want to create some spaces for you to speak to each other about your experiences in relation to informal learning and how it might take place. So this is the activity, and Derek in a moment is very kindly going to put you all into randomly assigned breakout rooms of, I think, 3 people. And this is the question that we would, or this is the prompt for a small and short conversation we would like you to have. In small groups, share an example of informal learning or informality that is part of your educational setting or your pedagogy or your process. So that might be quite spatial and material. It might be about interactions. I mean, you can kind of go anywhere with that, where we're just kind of really interested in you sharing with each other some experiences or reflections on informal learning. I'm wondering, Layla, what did we say time-wise for this?
I think we did say 15 minutes, but it could be shorter if we're struggling for time.
Derek, what does that feel like? 15? How does that feel?
Maybe go for 10, because I think there's enough here. We can probably do the 3 per room thing. And would 10 minutes be okay?
Yeah, okay.
I mean,
the key thing is, it's just making sure everybody gets an opportunity in each room to briefly kind of say something about their own setting. I think that's what's important. And we're not going to be asking people to summarize those discussions when you come back in. We will reach back to them later on, but you're not under any pressure to record them in some coherent way and then articulate them. So just enjoy that conversation with each other.
Cool. And some rooms might only have 2 participants in them. A couple might end up with 4, but it'll be round about that. So yeah. And we'll give you a bit of a shout, sort of 30 seconds before we close all the rooms at the end of it. Okay. But yeah,
this is being recorded, Derek. Are you going to cut this bit out?
Yeah, I'll definitely.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll do a bit of selective editing. I mean, depending. I mean, I don't actually know what Zoom takes as a recording when you do breakout spaces, so it'll be interesting to find out. But I'll maybe do yeah.
I guess this is like an informality, isn't it? That's kind of cutting into the formality. Maybe we need to keep it visible.
It was until I mentioned the recording thing, wasn't it?
Yes.
So how did you make use of the 30 seconds of semi-formal, semi-informal awkwardness that is the announcement that the breakout room's about to end?
We just carried on talking and got cut off. Thank you, Derek.
Excellent. Okay, well, thank you very much for all coming back to the main room. If you could all please just mute your microphones quickly, that'd be greatly appreciated. It'll save me having to go down such a big list. I'm a bit lazy like that. And I'll just hand back to James and Layla.
Thank you, Derek. And I guess by us putting the slide back up like this, we're kind of indicating back to formalities, aren't we? Interestingly, we were just having a conversation, myself, Derek and Layla, which got very informal. And then Derek reminded us it was being recorded. And then we were having quite an interesting debate as to whether there would be something kind of that conceptual continuity if we keep this in when we make it available. So you get to see what other people's informalities look like. Back to semi-formal discussion of some of these implications. I'm going to hand over to Layla.
Thanks, James. Yeah, hopefully you've all kind of started to share some of those informalities that are present in your own kind of spaces. But yeah, to get back into the discussion around, I guess, our findings, if you want to go to the next slide, James, what we really found was that I guess this research began to provide detail and a language for what goes on in the studio in, around and after formal pedagogy. And as a result, we make the infrastructure of the studio visible and its potential functions visible. I think I asked you to switch the slide too early, but never mind. But by comparing informal pedagogy of the physical studio with distance design education, in this particular context, what became visible to us anyway was that informal functions completely disappeared. So, you know, the functions that I began to outline, those 5 things, we just couldn't identify in student accounts that we did during the pandemic. And despite our best efforts to create Hangouts, which I'm sure all of you kind of implemented in those distant moments using Miro, WhatsApp chat, social Zooms, we did like this terrible spatial chat thing. I guess we found that informal pedagogy really kind of disappeared. And we was, you know, asking, is it possible to have it with distanced education? But, you know, this explains a large part of what I guess creative students struggled with during the pandemic. And yeah, that leads us to formulate the idea of the proximate studio, the physical studio, as a regulated freedom of what we're coming to call it. So if we put the little definition for that, James, I guess it's simultaneously regulated by powerful norms and expectations while constituted of openness and a sense of possibility inherent in creative practice. And in contrast, the distance education in this context offers unregulated freedom, a loosening of some norms and expectations alongside openness of creative practice. And, you know, paradoxically, the distance setting worked to narrow the approaches for students who freed off seeing their peers' work. So for others, it liberated them from the tropes of what it means to look and behave like a graphic designer and challenge the representation of the studio. And there was a really powerful response by one student of colour, and, you know, and significantly in the minority, discussed finding new and more representative communities online. So they said, when you're physically in the studio, the designers who come in and speak to you are a very particular target group of people. Whereas for me, being online, I ventured out into a different community of people. Being a designer who was a person of colour, I found that in the studio, the people who were coming in were targeted at a certain group of people that assumed we were all the same. Whereas with things online, I've been going to international events and joining communities of Black women who are designers or female designers. Online for me, I've expanded my community for myself and reached out to more people and found where my identity feels comfortable. And I don't think I would have found that without engaging with online events. So I guess we're beginning to see that opening up of those spaces in those distant moments was, you know, it gave students a chance to engage in these new spaces and think quite critically about what hadn't been apparent within those proximate studio spaces. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's probably important to say that while we're saying in the instance that we researched that it felt like it was exceptionally difficult for that informality to exist at distance, we're not saying that it can't happen at distance. It's not our area of expertise. It was certainly specific here. But yes, this opening up and this closing down that was going on simultaneously, I guess it really did alert us to, more than we even realized, the importance of kind of like thinking about that in that physical kind of environment. So look, I'm just going to say a little bit more now, just to zoom out ever so slightly about just thinking about the relationship between informal and formal again, which we began sort of with at the start. And as a way of kind of drawing this to a close, we've begun to problematize that relationship a little bit more, and that may well have come up in some of the conversations that happened in the breakout rooms as well. So in the paper, we kind of, and this is how it sits in the paper at the moment. We've just done some thinking about this after submitting the paper, I guess. We talked about this idea that the informal in the proximate studio, in the physical studio, this informal undergirding the formal studio. So it's still present, it's a large part of it, it's much less visible, but it's kind of working underneath. So you've got formal and informal. But even in the paper, we were a little bit uncomfortable with that kind of simplistic binary, I think, of those relationships. So in the paper, we started to propose almost like, I guess, a spectrum, which might move crudely from formal to structured informal to unstructured to social. Now, the intention between the language around structured and unstructured is, structured informal pedagogy, in a way, is a way of articulating, I guess, to some extent, the intentional moves we might make as educators in the way that we put our studios together to encourage those possibilities. The unstructured is perhaps the stuff that's a little bit more out of our kind of reach. So we were seeing this kind of line of, I guess, a spectrum from formal to informal. But actually, you know, and this is our reflection subsequently to publishing this still feels quite linear, and actually as a heuristic, it may have some value as a model, it may have some limited value, but we're not sure it kind of operates like this. So we've been doing a little bit more reading around informal pedagogy, and interestingly, in a way, going out of the space of design education research and more into the space of educational research, which, you know, arguably we maybe should have done when we were writing the paper. And we came across this work by Malcolm et al, who kind of really, they did a very systematic literature review of how formal, informal, and semi-formal pedagogy is talked about. And the kind of key findings they have, which I think are really useful here, is that actually, in all educational learning situations, there are always aspects of informal and formal learning, if you like, going on. So in all situations. But they describe this idea of informality in a formal learning situation. So I guess that might be very obvious example, the chat at the beginning of a taught session that precedes the actual teaching. The moments where we're saying, what did you do this weekend? That's a very basic example of informality, informal. And they also talked about the idea of formality in informal learning. So there's always formality in informal moments as well. So really their point was, the important stuff here is about these things and that being deeply interrelated. They cannot be separated, or you cannot just have one and that they're interrelated. But maybe it's kind of like it's how they're interrelated that can vary, and it's how they're interrelated that we can kind of think about actively in relation to our practices, I suppose. We also think there's something, so that was my brief attempt to visualize that notion of the informal in the informal, etc. Again, it's still feeling quite technocratic at the moment. The other thing that I think kind of is more a hypothesis rather than kind of empirically kind of situated is that it feels like informal and informalities have a big role to play in design education. We would surmise, as many of you probably would be thinking yourselves, it's got something to do with the disciplinary knowledge practices of our area. So for example, if we just think about the idea of, you're teaching creativity, you're teaching for the unknown, concepts of practice, uncertainty, ambiguity, tacit knowledge. Perhaps there is a very good set of reasons around those kind of knowledge structures and how we kind of open people up to those that requires informalities and informal to be maybe, arguably, hypothetically, more present. So perhaps the challenge is to both recognize, but to think about those implications really. So by way of a very, very brief conclusion, and then that will leave a few minutes, I think, for questions. In our paper, it supports some earlier work that around kind of the, I'm actually like referring to some of Derek's research here, and I've lost the line I was going to say. Sorry, Derek. Right, I've got it now. One of the things that Derek Jones, 2021, that visible practice of the studio, although well documented, are only part of how education happens. So we feel like we're kind of supporting that view. We're substantiating some of the earlier work around kind of the everyday activities that took place in studio. that studio is an active mediating, structuring space. The physical studio certainly, where these interrelations can be kind of thought about, perhaps deliberately played with. An example from the place that myself and Layla researched was there were sofas in that studio. That's not uncommon, but those sofas were used in very active, kind of quite deliberate ways. And we're actually writing a paper on that at the moment. We found that this informal pedagogy was much less visible. I mean, Malcolm et al. Would argue it's still going to be present at distance education, but it was much less visible in the version we researched. So we're kind of interested in how that might work in those settings from people that may well know, Derek. And finally, I guess this idea about what we did notice with the distance education stuff is that how it was rupturing some of the patterns to the physical studio in really kind of productive ways, particularly kind of where it was rupturing the norms and how normative some of those kind of ways of being in that studio were, and how the distance just kind of gave students an opportunity to find other ways of being. So I guess it kind of supports a lot of the critical pedagogy work here about being deeply attentive to those shared spaces. Layla, is there anything you wanted to say just at that end point?
No, I think, yeah, that was good. Got it all covered, James.
So, I mean, we've got 3 questions for you. Well, you could pick one. And in a way, I guess we are asking these questions maybe with a throwback to the conversations that you had in those breakout rooms. And these may be a way to prompt somebody maybe perhaps sharing a conversation or an aspect of the conversation that they had in one of those breakout rooms in relation to some of these questions around access, who can kind of have access to that informal side of stuff, or even what you feel like the tutor's role is in that. So in fact, I'm just going to shut up and let those questions sit there.
Yeah, cool. No, thanks very much for that, James. And I think they are really quite important questions. I've put a link to James and Layla's paper, the one in the Design and Technology Education and International Journal. Is that the most relevant link, James? Is that the? Or please feel free to add another link if you've got a follow-up.
Well, I think so. I mean, I'm as the editor of the journal, Derek, I'm going to go with you knowing how to get us there.
Okay, yeah, that'll be good for our metrics. Yeah, whatever. It's an interesting paper. It's a really interesting subject. I think it's actually an exceptionally important subject. I'm not going to ask any questions or sort of direct anything. If you could please put your hands up for this conversation. There's quite a few of us in the room. We've got a few minutes for sort of final questions, or maybe even responses to some of those questions that James and Layla were posing at the end there. Does anybody want to have a go first? Morgan, of course. Brilliant. Go for it, Morgan.
Yeah, we had a lovely conversation in our breakout room, and one thing that was touched on in terms of who's has access to these informal spaces is whether people have sort of the privilege and the conditions to spend time, spend large quantities of time within the studio. So if a student has part-time jobs or full-time jobs that they're competing with in order to have access to this education, it means that they leave out those sort of long stretches of time within the studio. So I think that was something that really stood out to me.
I think I'd maybe just really quickly add to that the flip side of it as well, Morgan, perhaps. It's not just what access do they have to, because that presupposes that the informal space is over there and you almost need permission to go into that. But the lovely example that Layla gave towards the end of the presentation is maybe there's these other spaces that we are not recognizing. You know, we are too centric, if you like. We are not recognizing or acknowledging these other spaces that already exist. That's maybe the flip side to this as well, perhaps.
Layla, did you want to respond to Morgan at all?
Yeah, it was really beautiful reflection, Morgan. Thank you. I think we've it was something, as we approached the end of this kind of research, was something we was really beginning to kind of consider as to the types of identities that are privileged because of these kind of informal, I guess, the conditions that you need to meet in order to get to these informal moments, which, like you say, includes spending a lot of time in the studio, which a lot of people don't have that time, or even just like different ideas of what it means to be comfortable in a space. So we're starting to, like James said, writing up a paper about the sofa. And whilst we know in like a Western context, sofas are the comfy place that you kind of hang out, chill out on, all those kind of informal moments. But, you know, we're starting to even think about that in quite a critical sense, that, you know, a sofa isn't the ideal place of comfort for everybody. And that's a Eurocentric kind of view in itself. So definitely, yeah, I think that kind of remaining quite critical about what it means to be informal or to be comfortable is, yeah, very important. So yeah, thank you for that reflection, Morgan.
Cool. And what's also really cool, almost from like a meta level, is the fact that we are actually even taking that discussion seriously, if you like, as a group of researchers and scholars. That's quite powerful. You know, the fact that we're taking something that can be dismissed so readily and actually really properly ask quite hard questions of it as well. It's really cool to see. Clive.
Yeah, for those that don't know me, I'm a senior lecturer in design at the OU, but before that I was the course director of an MA product design program at Coventry University, and the bulk of my students by far were international students, and of those the majority were Chinese students. And it is a slightly stereotypical thing, but it's nevertheless true, is that such students tended not to participate and engage in conversation and discussion in formal learning spaces, studio or otherwise. But what we did find is that there's exactly those same students, if you got them in a social context, in a cafe, Costa Coffee, in a bar, would engage and talk happily and self-consciously about almost anything. And so to kind of reinforce the point being made earlier, what I did in the significant number of rewrites we did for the course was to introduce the informal into the formal, in as much as we'd organise international study trips to some European location. We'd visit places of design interest, and then our debrief would take place in a restaurant where we would discuss what we'd seen, you know, principles of the Bauhaus, or the design of architecture in Lisbon, whatever. And the conversations there just flowed. There was no sense that any student, no matter how shy, was made to feel unthreatened, and conversation, discussions, and some quite profound insights emerged in a way that's just did not happen in the studio. So I think that sense of what a space is, the dynamics of that space and the way it makes people feel, you know, the idea of a comfy sofa in the corner of the studio and giving places for people to engage in non-self-conscious ways. It's incredibly important. And the common denominator that we found was basically revolved around food and the sharing, the provision of enjoyment of food. You know, this is the cement that kind of culturally seemed to bind us all together and help us to relax and engage in a way that felt entirely natural and non-threatening.
That's a fabulous example, Clive. I mean, just an observation about what you said there was that fascinated me was your attention to the interrelations between, if you like, the formal and the informal, and like how you connected those points together to sort of change the pedagogy, I suppose, in a way. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and the student loved it. I mean, the common feedback we get from those is they felt that these kind of trips were the best part of the course. You know, it's fantastic.
Cool. And I'm going to come to Thomas quickly. Yep. I'll come to you in a second, Robert. Yep.
Yes, expanding on what Clive was saying, and I'm recognizing I haven't read your paper yet, but when you were discussing all these topics, I couldn't avoid thinking on the situation of historical experiences like the School of Ulm in Germany, where because of the physical situation of the school, students and faculty were living in this isolated space, more, if you want, in a monastic approach to education. And of course, they had their formal classes, but because they were living together, they had a lot of informal spaces to share knowledge. And my understanding is that their education at the end was a lot supported by all these informal situations. I think that we lost the opportunity of having that now. I don't think that such a situation will work in contemporary times. But certainly there's value in all these informal situations around the formal encounters that we have in traditional classes.
Thomas, thank you for that example. Can I ask like a quick follow-up question? You said you don't think that would work in contemporary times. I'd just be interested to know what was lurking behind that, why you think it wouldn't work.
Because I don't think that the students will be willing to move to such a space in isolation of the rest of the world to, you know, live and breathe design for a certain period of time. I don't have any evidence for that. It's just my impression.
Okay, I won't maybe respond directly to that one, Tomas. I mean, I think we could definitely offer some suggestions as to how that can actually take place. And I wonder whether or not there's another weird duality that happens there, that whether it's online or face-to-face. Again, it's maybe not as simple or as straightforward as that. And certainly from our experience, the effort you have to put into creating those sorts of spaces, or even the analogues of those spaces, is phenomenal. It's just as much, if not more, than it would be in a physical space. But not to shut down those students' experiences where they have welcomed hybrid spaces and actually they've found their own informal and semi-formal and formal spaces themselves. I think that's still quite important, and it's maybe not as black and white sometimes as our institutions demand of us. I'll just leave that hanging there and maybe come to Robert to see if, sorry, James, I didn't mean to cut across you unless you wanted to respond in a different way. Is that, yeah, okay. Robert, go for it.
Yep. Okay. Fantastic stuff. I mean, for us at Warwick, designing essentially the start of a design school and our undergraduate courses and all this stuff from scratch, this is so important. And this is exactly the main pedagogic challenge we're looking at, because we're trying to balance, get the best of the kind of studio kind of environment and, in building the kind of social community and getting the students to do this informal learning together in a self-sustaining way, and also in a lifelong learning way. So they're going to take these habits with them, but also doing that in a way in which they're not just enclosed in the studio, and we want the openness to the world. So that's fantastic. And, this stuff is really, really important. But I just want to get back to the point about food. So we had a research project at Warwick, staff student thing, and they were looking at the potential role of food sharing in building the right kind of relationships between students and teachers and students, etc. And it turned out to be really, really transformational. Getting students to be bringing food to share with each other from their own culture and using that as a talking point was a really, really powerful thing to do. So yeah, it's not just because I'm a greedy bastard and I like a bit of food, but food is really a good thing. It's against all the rules here. We're not allowed to bring food into the rooms, but it works.
Excellent. Yeah, James or Layla, I don't know if you wanted to respond to that one or.
Well, just really, I mean, that's really interesting. Thank you, Robert. I think there's something, isn't there, about I don't know whether it's quite bound up in the food there, but the bringing of the authentic self into these spaces and into relations with others, which feels really important. And I had another point that was going to link to that, and it's completely gone. I'll leave it at that. This about bringing the authentic self. No, I know what the point was. There's that authenticity, but there's the idea, I guess, of education, which has this kind of disciplining quality to it as well, particularly where we are usually educating people to become designers. I mean, I understand that's a very specific way of articulating it. So there's ways of being that is required or may be required of that practice, but also that kind of openness of self. And yeah, I'm beginning to wonder where the extent to which informality plays a really important role in the negotiation of those challenges, I suppose.
Cool. Okay, I'm very conscious of time. I'll maybe just quickly to pick up on that one in some ways, James. Again, I'll reiterate the fact that this is so important, because until we start talking about this, until we make it visible and actually start to articulate it, there's a whole bunch of assumptions that are already going into these formal, semi-formal and informal spaces that we're just completely unaware of. There's quite a lot of harm sometimes that can be done, I think, in those spaces. And it does, some of them do exclude people, and because there's an assumption that you should feel relaxed in this particular way, in this particular space, using these particular behaviors. And if we're not talking about this, then nobody else will, and we will just continue to perpetuate just the same stuff. So I think this is a really important catalyst for conversation. I know that some of the themes that we'll be having over the next few months as well will revolve around about care, and these difficult to talk about spaces in design education, well, in education, never mind just design education. So I can only thank you so much once again, James and Layla, for having a go at this and looking at this in a in a rigorous way, and starting off some of the conversations about this. So yeah, thank you very much for that, and virtual round of applause and stuff for you both. Thank you. Just as a final quick reminder, as I say, this is the first of a series of 4 discussions. I will put the link to futures of design education. We need to get a better name, don't we? Upcoming events are in that link. Please feel free to sign up. And the final event in December, I'll post details of that as soon as I possibly can. But in the meantime, thank you for so many people coming along. I know it's Friday, but thank you so much for that. It was a really interesting conversation. I'll maybe also share links to the text chat and to some of the other follow-up material. And we'll maybe try to think of ways of maybe carrying this conversation on. I'm very conscious of the fact that we have these meetings and they're great, but it'd be nice to maybe do something a bit more with them. So if there's any ideas that anybody has for that, then please let us know and we'll have a think ourselves. So thank you all very much. Have a really good rest of your Friday, and thank you for the interaction and the conversation. And thank you, James and Layla, particularly. It was really good. Thank you.